While technology and tactics continue to evolve, there are some features of warfare that seem to never change. Infantrymen throughout history would probably agree on some fundamental truths, like the fact that most of war is boring, that the ability to sleep anywhere at any time is a critical infantryman skill, and that fighting in sub-zero temperatures absolutely sucks. And that last one's important because even if you know nothing else about Ukraine, you probably understand that it gets pretty cold there during winter. The idea of fighting a military campaign in winter is nothing new. Humanity has been fighting in extreme cold conditions for thousands of years. But just as that historical record shows that humans have been able to fight during winter for centuries, it also shows how quickly armies or even nations can have their military efforts completely undone once the temperature drops below zero. Even 2 centuries removed from the fact, people still remember the disintegration of Napoleon's Grande Armée as it undertook its winter retreat from Moscow. And so it's perhaps natural to ask what winter might mean for the armies now engaged in the fighting in Ukraine. Is one better prepared than the other? What does it mean for their tactics, for their operations? And how might it impact the lives of the civilians caught up in the conflict? Now, before I jump in, I want to openly admit the irony of someone from Australia trying to talk about winter conditions in Ukraine. I come from one of the hottest, driest continents on planet Earth. Most of the country is pretty sparsely populated for that reason, and there are a lot of places where you'll see temperatures in summer pretty routinely spike above 40 degrees Celsius. And I didn't get a chance to see snow in person until my first New York winter. In Europe or the US, December is a time of year where temperatures take a pretty steep dive. While in Australia, we're left wondering why the supermarkets or shopping centres blast us with Christmas music talking about winter and snow, when our greatest concern is getting heat blasted on the way home and, hoping that the country doesn't catch fire again as it tends to do every year or two. And so throughout this episode, expect for me to lean pretty heavily on historical and contemporary sources. Over the last month, in preparation for this episode, I've worked my way through hundreds of pages of manuals and documentation on the maintenance of equipment and tactics during winter. A number of examples are on the screen there. There are some US documents, ATP 3-90.97, which is on mountain warfare and cold weather operations, and also a number of helpful European publications in English. One example I've given here is UD 6-81-7E, which is a Norwegian manual on the instruction in winter service use and maintenance of equipment. What I have then done is reached out to experts in Ukraine or various Nordic countries and in the United States to confirm the findings that I pulled out of these pieces. Many thanks to those of you who supported that process. When we talk about the strategic or economic level of winter's impact on the conflict, however, that's a much more data-driven process, which I'll outline when we get to it. So with that out of the way, what am I actually going to be talking about today? First, I'm going to look at how cold Ukraine is actually, because I've read a number of articles that seem to be under the impression that all of Ukraine basically adopts the temperature set of Moscow in 1941, dropping below -30 and everyone freezing to death outside instantly. That's not really the case. Then I'm going to talk about tactical level impacts. How does winter impact fighting at the front and impact small units, manpower, and equipment? Then we're going to zoom out to the operational level. How does this affect the maneuver of large-scale units and also the logistics chains that support those units? And then finally put that together and say, okay, so how well prepared are the Russians and the Ukrainians for fighting in those conditions, and how will it likely impact them? And then because it's me, I can't resist zooming out to the strategic and the economic level of winter's impact on this conflict, because winter isn't just a reality for the fighters in the trenches at the front, it's a reality for the old, the sick, the vulnerable, or even the fit and healthy who are living in Ukraine's cities, in its towns and villages, who are subjected to the deep freeze conditions. In many ways, I'm hoping that will serve as something of a preview for an upcoming video on the Russian strategic bombing offensive targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure and what its impacts and prospects of success are. So we're going to open then with a discussion of how cold is cold in a Ukrainian context, because that word means different things around the world. To an Australian from Queensland, any weather you can't wear shorts in is cold. Meanwhile, a number of the Scandinavians I've had a chance to talk to over the years seem to regard any temperature that won't instantly freeze gasoline to be entirely serviceable. US and other manuals tend to divide cold into a number of threat brackets based on their characteristics and the behaviours required to operate in them. Those levels bring with them different impacts on troop behaviour, equipment, and sustainment requirements. Because the sort of equipment and practices that might be entirely necessary to protect your life at 40 degrees below zero might mostly just be a hindrance if you're only just ducking below freezing. For the sake of consistency, for this presentation, I've adopted the definitions in the Mountain Warfare and Cold Weather Operations Leader book by the Center for Army Lessons Learned, which I'm going to take you through quickly. By default, I'll give all temperatures in Celsius, although for the benefit of American listeners, I will try and remember to include Fahrenheit conversions. At the top of the list, you've got wet cold. This runs from +3 to -7 degrees Celsius. For Australians, this is Canberra cold. For Americans, that's +39 to 20 in your freedom-based temperature units. And this is where the temperature range in a lot of Ukraine will sit on average. And from a military perspective, wet cold kinda sucks. You'd instinctively think that the lower temperature the worst, but wet cold has problems of its own, because in this sort of range, rain and snow can coexist. There's moisture everywhere. It's not just about cold and frost, you've also got mud and moisture everywhere. And the problem with that, of course, is that there's basically no quicker way to get cold than to get wet. If a bit of uniform gets soaked through, then wind chill in the surrounding environment is going to sap the heat out of that individual at an incredibly rapid rate. Immersion in water will increase heat loss by something like 25 times when compared to just being surrounded by cold air, and in this temperature things are just warm enough that the moisture is everywhere and determined to kill you. Or, to use the words directly from the manual, this type of environment is more dangerous to troops and equipment than colder, dry cold environments. So in some ways, as the temperature drops further, things actually get a little bit better. At -7 through -20 degrees Celsius, that's 19 to 4 in the nonsense alternative temperature units used in the United States, you get what the manual calls dry cold. Here, mobility can actually increase because the ground, which was previously muddy and sodden, starts to consistently harden. There's no risk of the temperature occasionally ducking above 0 degrees, meaning people get stuck in the mud as you have a constant thaw-freeze cycle. No, things are consistently frozen, and wind chill is now the primary threat. And there are a lot of places in Ukraine that will see this temperature range at least a reasonable proportion of the time, even if the average isn't below -7. Unfortunately for human beings, Mother Nature doesn't stop at -20, and when you drop below -20 all the way to -32, you're in the domain of intense cold. Once again, like life sucked before, but life now really sucks once again. Because as the manuals point out, at this stage, the temperature can affect the mind as much as the body. Simple tasks take longer, and attention to detail diminishes. Protective clothing and equipment can become quite bulky, which diminishes the individual sort of alacrity, agility, dexterity of individuals involved, and we'll talk about some of the associated equipment issues later on. But fighting at these temperatures certainly isn't impossible, and a number of the decisive engagements of 1941's winter fighting on the Eastern Front were fought in these intense cold conditions. Drop down again to -32 degrees Celsius, which is I think -25 degrees Fahrenheit, you're in what the manuals would call extreme cold. And here the focus turns from being militarily effective against an opponent to simply staying alive. As the manual puts it, the challenge of survival becomes paramount. It observes that personnel will often withdraw themselves and adopt a cocoon-like existence. Because humans do have some evolved inbuilt behaviours for dealing with very, very cold conditions, and one of them is the desire to simply get static and preserve as much heat as possible. There certainly have been military engagements fought in this temperature range, but it's pretty damn demanding, and inadequately protected personnel are at serious risk. And yet, in a number of places in Ukraine, the record low temperatures do drift into this category. Finally, below -40 degrees, which frankly is something that's going to give me nightmares to even conceive of, you have hazardous cold. This is the domain of the very worst of Russian winters. And at this temperature levels, manuals tend to advise officers to think very, very carefully before ordering their units to do, well, anything. At this level, offensive operations with men and materiel that are not specifically trained for an adapted environment is basically a non-starter. As the manual puts it, units are extensively trained before undertaking an operation in these temperature extremes. Inadequately prepared units are likely to be rendered combat ineffective, which is a nice way of saying that a lot of the personnel involved, if stuck in the open, are likely to freeze to death. These are the conditions that I think the popular imagination conjures when you think of the Russian winter during World War II. In reality, mercifully, these conditions are incredibly rare, at least in the geographical zones that we're talking about. Because Russia isn't invading the Arctic Circle, they're invading Ukraine. And at the moment, a particular locus of the fighting is the Donbass region, so I put up the climate details for the city of Donetsk in the top right there. What you can see there is it's mostly a bunch of wet, cold weather, with average high temperatures below zero, but daily mean temperatures of around 2 to 4 degrees and daily average low temperatures of between -7 and 5.4, depending on whether it's December, January, or February. That puts most of the temperature results most of the time in that wet-cold range, where troops have to coexist with mud, rain, and moisture, as well as the cold. Now, of course, temperatures don't always hug the average. You can get cold snaps. The record low temperatures that you can see there are like -28.5, -32.2, temperatures that push that part of the Donbass deep into that sort of intense and extreme cold range. But for the most part, it's a miserable combination of snow and rain in that sort of wet-cold bracket. For comparison, I also looked at the figures for Zaporizhia. They're very slightly warmer, but again, the average sits entirely within the wet-cold range. Cold, wet, and dangerous, but not something humans haven't had to deal with before. So having established this means that Russian and Ukrainian troops are mostly going to have to live amongst a horrible combination of mud, snow, and freezing temperatures. Let's look at what that might mean on a tactical level. The first point to make is that winter impacts both concealment and the ability of units to move. In terms of mobility, there are a lot of losers. In terms of infantry on foot, the manuals suggest that a little bit of snow cover, depending on the exact nature of the snowfall and the troops' equipment, whether they have snowshoes, etc., generally reduces dismounted movement speed by somewhere between 50 and 75% when a unit's on the march. As for wheeled vehicles, it might be somewhat better than it was during mud season, but at the same time, in that sort of wet-cold bracket, off-road driving for wheeled vehicles is still not likely to be a pleasant experience in all places. For aircraft and drone operators, winter means overcast conditions, it means reduced visibility, it means there may be fewer days where all platforms are capable of operating, and even if they are operating, their ability to visually appraise targets or positions on the ground is somewhat diminished. The only real winners in terms of vehicular mobility are things that run on tracks. Because while they hate the deep mud of mud season as much as other vehicle classes do, snow, firmer ground, those that they can handle. Unfortunately for the tanks, as we'll talk about later, the fuel trucks necessary to keep them operating aren't quite so all-terrain. And then there's the impact on concealment, which is a critical one to talk about because the best way to not get killed on the modern battlefield is not to be seen. And on that front, winter's a little bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, foliage disappears, vehicles need to be repainted because suddenly your green and grey camo kind of stands out against the all-white of the background, and humans and equipment again also stand out against all-white. Camouflaging a vehicle with greenery and a camo net is going to be less effective when the surrounding environment doesn't really include any greenery anymore. But on the flip side, this is a time of year where cloud cover is prevalent something like 80% of the time in Donetsk. For expensive drones with all-weather characteristics and thermal cameras, this is fine. In fact, thermal cameras have an absolute field day during cold weather conditions. There's just a greater contrast between humans and vehicles and the rest of the surrounding environment. But if you're doing optical scans using a cheap DJI drone, well, these weather conditions might actually reduce the number of viable flying days. On balance, this is an environment that rewards the prepared and certain high-end capabilities. If you have lots of thermal capabilities and you're able to redo your camouflage in order to adapt to winter conditions, you're in a better condition than someone who's still using the same techniques and camo and equipment that they were using a couple of months ago. But in the winter, protecting your personnel from the environment is almost as important as protecting them from enemy forces. Hypothermia, frostbite, trench foot, these things can cause casualties and attrition just as surely as enemy action can. So keeping warm and dry matters. And I stress the point about keeping dry there because getting wet is a rapid path towards hypothermia. And as one expert put it, the easiest way to stay warm is not to get cold. And in these conditions, there are suddenly a lot more things you need to do to protect and maintain humans that are out in trench systems or exposed to the elements than during this summer, for example. Most manuals recommend issuing a dizzying array of gear with multiple layers, specialized tents, and other equipment to protect personnel who are going to be in the open. Caloric requirements increase. The recommendation is for almost 4 meals a day, with 2 of them being hot meals in a number of the sources I reviewed. There's also a question of quality of shelter and rotation requirements. You can't keep troops in a trench system for as long, for example, before you rotate them back to the rear so that they can warm up and be cared for. Earlier on in this war, rotation was something we weren't seeing in a lot of cases. Before Russia went over to a mobilized state, many Russian units complained that they simply weren't rotated from the front lines because there were no units to rotate and replace them. Similarly, Ukraine in the early days of the war had territorial defense units fighting in the Donbass that weren't rotated in some cases for months at a time because mobilization hadn't built up forces to replace them and rotate in to replace them at that point. In warm weather, that's still a terrible idea for troops' combat effectiveness and for their mental health. But during winter, that may well be a death sentence because if you're not rotating back people into warm environments for proper care, well, they can decay as a force pretty quickly. And in this sense, the conditions favour units that are defending fixed or well-prepared defensive positions. If you're operating from a town that hasn't been destroyed, or out of basements, or out of a city, or out of just defensive positions that you've had years to establish, well, those are going to give you more protection from the elements and more local facilities than troops that are operating out of trenches that they dug a week ago. It also means certain tactics can have consequences. If you review the drone footage from some of the Donetsk fighting, for example, the Russians have in a number of cases utterly destroyed all buildings that could provide shelter or cover in particular towns as a means to push Ukrainian defenders out. But adopting that tactic means that when Russian troops move into that position, there's no cover or shelter from the elements. And while I've focused a lot on how a winter environment, particularly a wet, cold environment, can really punish humans, low temperatures can be pretty punishing for equipment as well. Plastic and metal can become brittle, more likely to crack. You can have water and ice penetrating into equipment. You can have feed issues with automatic weapons as a result of snow and ice on cartridges, which can diminish the reliability of the feed mechanism. The list goes on. A lot of lubricants or liquids that are perfectly fine for use during the summer can become viscous, unreliable, or even freeze during winter conditions. And one commonly forgotten element is that batteries can actually lose a significant amount of their effectiveness in cold temperatures. If you're talking about old school Soviet-style alkaline batteries, at 0 degrees that battery's lost 15% of its capacity. At negative 10 degrees it's down to 70% capacity, and by negative 20 it's down to 30% of its regular capacity. A very old school zinc battery is operating at 10% efficiency once you're at negative 20 degrees Celsius, which means you're left hucking 10 times as much battery weight for the same amount of charge. In 1,000 different ways, humans might not like cold temperatures, but engineers aren't exactly fond of them either. And even if things aren't breaking out right, you just need more stuff in order to operate in a cold weather environment. You're introducing a whole bunch of additional cold weather clothing and survival equipment. People suddenly need vapor barrier boots, they need new gloves, they need new uniforms and equipment. You're introducing heaters and generators, support equipment. All of this now means you need more equipment and more fuel at the front, which is a logistical strain that we'll point to later. Light infantry operating in a cold weather environment can have twice the caloric requirements of an ordinary person going about their day in a regular environment. I've got a table there on the screen showing the dizzying array of space heaters that the US military recommends for various tents and shelters in cold weather conditions. All of this is stuff that you don't need if the temperature is 20 degrees above 0 Celsius. And while there are plenty of internet tough guys out there who say that real men can handle the cold and that Russians don't need any of this fancy winter equipment, I'd like to know how many of them have tried to huddle in a muddy ditch at 5 degrees below 0 in summer uniform. And a lot of this stuff is barely optional. If you were given a choice between supplying troops with modern assault rifles but summer uniforms in winter conditions, or giving them Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifles but top-tier socks, thermal underwear, jackets, trousers, all the winter kit they need, I think there's a strong argument for the latter. In a war that's mostly being fought by artillery, infantry spend an awful lot of time guarding trenches and defensive positions. You fire your rifle once in a blue moon, but you're fighting the weather off 24/7. So basically, the next time a Call of Duty game comes out, maybe they should spend less time on the weapon customization system and more on allowing players to make sure they choose appropriately selected thermal insulating layers. And beyond just demands for more equipment and more logistical support, cold weather environments put a greater premium on training and discipline, because it takes more effort, initiative, and know-how to keep a unit combat effective at these temperatures than it does if it's a balmy 20 degrees. There is a reason in the US that every time troops are expected to operate below 0 degrees, ATP 3-90.97 calls for them to have gone through the Arctic Light Individual Training Program, although I'm not clear on whether or not recruits from Alaska and the like are exempted from that requirement. As the manual puts it, cold weather environments put a premium on skill, discipline, and leadership. And if you think about all these stupid ways people can screw up in a cold weather environment, that statement makes a whole bunch of sense. Experienced and proactive NCOs can be engaged in making sure that troops are staying dry as much as possible. They're drinking enough water, that they're going through the 2 to 3 daily checks for frostbite and health concerns that the manual recommends. And they can train and berate their men to avoid common mistakes. Troops that are cold, for example, are not going to want to be cold, and so an ill-disciplined unit might do things like build an open fire in order to get warm, which is a great way to get detected and destroyed by artillery. Troops that are in cold weather aren't going to want to dig and entrench themselves. They're not going to want to spend time camouflaging their positions. They're just going to want to stay warm. And so it takes a motivated unit and good NCOs to make sure they do the hard work. When equipment starts freezing, it's going to take a disciplined and well-trained operator to patiently thaw that piece of equipment and care for it properly, as opposed to try and force it, resulting in them breaking knobs or damaging equipment. Soviet-era equipment is designed to be soldier-proof, yes, but even it is vulnerable to the laws of physics. The manual also highlights the difficulty in maintaining a culture of proactivity and aggression in an environment where everyone is really bloody cold and just wants to stay warm. If you are in a sheltered position, it takes a special kind of motivation to want to go outside and aggressively raid or harass enemy positions, as opposed to just sheltering and staying warm. There might be a temptation for people comfortable at home to dismiss those sort of concerns, but if you think about how hard it sometimes is to get out of bed on a cold day when you are comfortable and the outside room is freezing, well, apply that to a situation where the outside is a frozen battlefield. And in many cases, the soldiers involved aren't soldiers by profession and don't want to be there. Are Private Conscriptovich and his mates going to go on a reconnaissance patrol? Or are they just going to write a report that said they did? And finally, there are two that I've added based on observations and commentary on the war in Ukraine so far. The first is alcohol consumption, because I've often seen complaints from Russian units that other Russian units they're relying on for support are basically drunk. In a cold weather environment, boozing it up on the front line is a terrible idea. You're going to feel warm, and you're going to be less disciplined. So your core temperature is going to drop. Alcohol does that. It bleeds the temperature out to your extremities, and at the same time, you're going to be less aware of the fact that you are wet, you are bleeding heat, and you're on a one-way train to hypothermia. And the second point is that units often complain that they are forgotten about or left in positions by command. Rotation is not optional when the temperature gets too low. If you want to preserve manpower and equipment, you need to pull people out of exposed positions on a regular basis. If that doesn't start happening, then casualties might mount. Or at the very least, discipline and combat power will begin to suffer. So put all that together, and what does it mean for ordinary troops? What does it mean at the tactical level? I guess a simple way of putting it would be that combat in cold weather conditions is more difficult than combat in pleasant conditions, and as a result, the advantage, all else being equal, passes to the more disciplined, better equipped, and well-prepared side. Poor discipline, poor training, poor equipment, those are things that can get troops killed or more likely make them seriously ill or combat ineffective when you're in a cold weather environment. If you don't keep your stuff dry, if you don't conceal yourself properly, if you don't look out for your troops, if you don't keep alcohol consumption down and caloric consumption up, that's a great way to diminish the combat effectiveness of a unit. Tactical movement's still possible. In fact, for tracked vehicles, it's actually easier in this environment than it is during the mud season, where you've got the massive thaw, which basically reduces a lot of Ukraine to a sea of mud. But dismounts and wheeled vehicles still suffer in this environment, not compared to mud season, but certainly compared to, for example, the summer. You've also got a supply consumption that increases as the force preservation requires you to send a whole bunch of additional gear to the front and make up for additional consumption. And there's a reason to suspect these factors will be a lot more painful this year than they have been since 2014. Because from 2014 until February of this year, the Russians and the Ukrainians were fighting from prepared positions on pretty set lines in the Donbass. It was regular Ukrainian army units and regular units of the so-called LNR, DNR that were doing the fighting from trenches that they'd had years to prepare, with a lot of organisation around support facilities and rotation. Now we've got the introduction of mobilised troops on both sides who do not have the same standards of training. The war is a lot more mobile, the lines have shifted, so there's a lot more troops fighting from less well-prepared positions. And as a result, as I've said, the advantage, all else being equal, will pass to the more disciplined, better equipped, and better prepared side. But towards the end there, I started to touch on supply concerns, logistics, fuel requirements, which means it's time to move up to a level with which I'm more familiar. Let's talk about the impacts of winter, one level up, at the operational level of this war. Because at this level, we're no longer talking about protecting the lives of individual soldiers or keeping individual units effective. We're talking about the ability to logistically supply, sustain, launch, and succeed in offensive operations. And the biggest point I wanted to make here up front is that winter doesn't mean the fighting is likely to stop. There's been a lot of commentary talking about winter as a time where the fighting will die down and there's an opportunity for negotiations or diplomacy or whatnot. I don't see a historical basis to conclude that the fighting is likely to stop over winter. Quite the opposite. Historically, 20th century armies fighting in Ukraine have launched a number of winter offensives, particularly during the Second World War. The Soviet offensives in Ukraine in 1943 through 44 were fought in December, January, February, like in the depths of winter, and they were some relatively effective operations that shifted the front line considerably. And before the fighting in Ukraine, when you look at the winter offensives that were fought deeper in the Soviet Union, those campaigns were fought at even lower temperatures than the fighting in Ukraine, which in some ways highlighted the difficulties of operating at a very cold but slightly higher temperature, because the fighting in Ukraine was plagued by that sort of thaw cycle, that wet-cold issue that wasn't so much of an issue when you talk about the deep freeze that surrounded operations around, for example, Moscow. And I don't bring this up to rebut the idea of peace talks specifically. I think the real reason peace talks are a terrible idea right now is because Russia has made clear that it wants to annex significant parts of Ukraine, something that not even its ostensible allies like China will recognise. In a situation where Russian demands are manifestly unreasonable and unacceptable to most of the world, and where Ukraine feels they have an initiative, a ceasefire is basically walking into a Russian trap. But no, the reason I bring this up is to establish that from a historical perspective, even without the benefits of modern technology, armies in this part of the world have known how to fight in these sort of conditions. It's not new. They've even done it before in Ukraine specifically. I've got images of German troops and German aircraft operating in roughly January, February of 1944 in Ukraine there on the right. To take just one example, if you look at the Battle of Cherkasy Korsun, where there was a pocket of German troops that was created by the Soviet armies, you had a war of movement fought in horrible conditions that included snow, wind, mud, everything that we've talked about so far. The Soviets achieve a breakthrough in January, the Germans launch relief attacks through February, and then there's a breakout operation that gets most of the German troops, but not most of their equipment, out of a pocket that at its initial stages contains about 60,000 German troops. So this is a large-scale battle of maneuver which involves a Soviet penetration into operational depths, German counteroffensives, and an eventual evacuation in these conditions in Ukraine using 1940s technology and know-how. If we operate on the assumption that T-72s are better than T-34s and armies tend to learn over time, then it's reasonable to suggest that if a military could operate in the 1940s in these conditions, it's probably capable of operating in them in 2022. And one reason the Soviets tended to launch winter offensives, as well as the deleterious effect it had on the German military, is that as the ground firmed up, it enabled the movement, particularly of tracked units. Secondary and unpaved roads that might be a sea of mud during mud season can firm up and become viable for vehicles during winter. Small watercourses or even large watercourses can freeze, although don't make the mistake of assuming that just because a river has frozen, you can take a tank column over it. Infantry, perhaps. Tank column, usually no. There are also a lot of small other factors that come together to mean that winter can enable better offensive operations at the operational level than the mud season that immediately precedes or follows it. For example, landmines are less effective in deep snow, or at least most landmine designs can become less effective in deep snow. If the mine is buried under a whole bunch of snow, well then troops marching on top of it is less likely to detonate that mine. Put all these factors together and you can see why a Soviet tank army might have a greater appreciation for winter than for mud season. The problem, of course, is that not all vehicles are tracked and tanks still require fuel, and logistics during winter are difficult. Fuel consumption can go up as generators are run or vehicles are idled in order to keep their crews warm, so that fuel needs to be pushed to the front. All that new winter equipment, that needs to be pushed to the front. Additional requirements for food and other support equipment to keep troops in good conditions at the front, that needs to be pushed up the logistics chain. Rotation and replacements for units that are in the open, well, that needs to be handled as well. Those troops need to be pulled back along ground lines of communication and replaced by other troops moving up on those same ground lines of communication. So even though the tanks and the tracked vehicles, the APCs and the IFEs, might have a better time in these winter conditions, they're still tied to their wheeled support vehicles and their logistics chain, and those logistic chains are still tied to good quality roads because you wouldn't want to take a wheeled vehicle across an open field in Ukraine during the winter. What this means is while it might be easier to conceive of a localized armored push during winter than during mud season, these dreams or discussions of deep penetrations into operational depths or grand encirclements, those are difficult to conceive of because the tanks, the armoured columns, would still need to be supported by vehicles that are going to have difficulty operating in these conditions. At least unless they have good, solid, secure road and rail systems to move along. At a higher level, the ability to write air support into operational plans is also likely to decrease. A lot of modern aircraft are indeed truly all-weather, if you're talking about combat aircraft. But that doesn't matter. That all-weather capability, the ability to fly and navigate all-weather, doesn't matter if the attack plan still involves visually acquiring a target and launching an attack using an unguided bomb or unguided rockets. What it is less likely to impact is the Russian air-to-air operations, some of which have been very effective. One effective Russian tactic, which has been noted by a number of Western observers, for example, is the extensive use of the missile I've got pictured on the screen there. That's the R-37. This is a very long-range air-to-air missile. NATO call sign is AA-13 from memory. And what the Russians have been doing is pairing this missile system with aircraft like the MiG-31, which is a very high-speed aircraft, to engage Ukrainian aircraft at very, very long range. Not get into a furball, not get into a dogfight, but to essentially zone out Ukrainian air operations from a very long sort of radius around the front. Short of absolutely hellish conditions, I don't see a reason why these sorts of operations would have to cease. And operating from permanent bases and well-prepared fields supported by a good number of maintenance technicians, I also don't see any reason to suggest the serviceability rate of these aircraft will drop anywhere near as much as, say, helicopters operating out of a temporary forward base where there's very little equipment to sustain them when the temperatures drop. So in total, you have factors that may favour localised offensives, but which punish the ability to do grand offensive operations, and which also diminish the advantage of whichever side relies more on its air support. But so far I've mostly talked about winter in a general sense, what requirements it imposes on troops, what characteristics it punishes, what characteristics it rewards. What I haven't talked about is how well prepared the Russians and the Ukrainians are for winter combat. And if you're talking about trying to predict how winter conditions will shape the fighting in Ukraine, well, that's a pretty critical question. And the first thing I'll say, very politely, is that those are suggesting the Russian army has no idea how to fight in winter and all of its troops are going to freeze to death should probably stop and think about what they just said. Suggesting that the Russians or the Ukrainians have no idea how to fight during winter, that's pure fantasy that doesn't pass the sniff test. This is not unfamiliar terrain for either side. Even if you just talk about modern history, if you leave the Second World War and other conflicts out of it, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians served between 2014 and 2022 in the Donbass during winter. So there's a lot of manpower out there that have at least some experience with these conditions. The Russian army likewise has given a lot of thought for many years on how to operate in cold weather. Indeed, how to operate in cold weather environments that are far harsher than those that you'll find in Ukraine. And if you look at the republics from which a lot of the Russian troops that were sent to Ukraine were drawn, A lot of these people are coming from environments that are colder and are going to be used to these sort of really harsh conditions. There are a lot of Buryats, for example, serving in Ukraine who have become casualties fighting for the Russians. If you look at Buryatia, the average daily temperature in January is something like negative 17 degrees Celsius, which is well below the negatives that you would expect to see on average somewhere like Donetsk. Russian equipment is designed with cold weather operation in mind. And the personnel that Russia is recruiting, well, they're going to at least have passing familiarity with living in cold conditions. So with that said, a properly supplied and well-trained Russian or Ukrainian unit with good discipline is probably going to manage the winter conditions just fine. In fact, they will probably manage it better than a lot of military units from a lot of other countries would. The problem, of course, is that we're no longer talking about a war between only well-trained, well-disciplined, and well-equipped units. Both sides have adopted mobilization. The armies have expanded greatly from their pre-war status, and there's a lot of mobilized personnel, including some very recently mobilized personnel on the Russian side, because their partial mobilization was only declared many months after Ukraine started their process. And it's here that you can start to have problems. We all remember the scenes from early in the war where Ukrainians were operating with, in some cases, their civilian clothing, or were told to bring their own equipment. Well, those experiences are now being mirrored by some on the Russian side, when people are being told to bring their own medical kits, to bring their own armor, to bring their own clothing, because the army is not guaranteed to issue them. At the same time, you've got volunteer units and proxy units that may not be properly integrated into the supply system. They're not in the pecking order for the equipment they need to survive winter, so they're potentially in trouble. And when it comes to unit discipline and survival skills, well, mobilized personnel with 2 weeks training might not necessarily have those skills, and by might not necessarily, I mean I would be seriously concerned. Because there is a significant difference between being used to living in a cold environment and knowing how to survive outdoors in a trench while maintaining unit discipline and cohesion and protecting your equipment. Things are easier when you can just go home and change into dry clothes and heat up around a fire, as opposed to surviving for days or weeks on end in a ditch with no open fire and no ability to change your clothing. So the next question becomes, what is the state of the equipment and the training issue on both sides? On the Ukrainian side, the call for winter equipment went out months ago. The basic underlying request was for enough winter clothing and equipment to supply about 200,000 troops in frontline conditions. And that was important because Ukraine may well have had enough winter equipment for its peacetime army, but expanding the force several times over, that required external support. And there has been a very strong response from donor countries to this request. I can't list all of the examples on screen, but here are a couple. Britain provided 25,000 sets of winter clothing, 12,000 sleeping kits, and 150 warm team tents, which is an important way for preserving manpower in the open in cold conditions. Canada, of course, there are, of course, problems with the Canadian military when it comes to the acquisition of capital equipment, weapon systems, but the Canadians do know how to survive in the cold, and they've come up with about 500,000 items of winter clothing. Estonia supplied enough for about 4,000 troops. Norway provided 55,000 units. The US earmarked a drawdown to purchase and supply winter equipment. And Germany's committed a very significant package of winter clothing as well. The list goes on. The most recent statement from the Ukrainians is that they have successfully made the switch over to their winter uniforms by this point, and they're comfortable that the supply of winter equipment and supplies coming in will be sufficient for winter conditions. The question, of course, is does the logistic and organizational system in Ukraine get all of it to the troops on time? We'll have a look at the evidence for the answer to that question in just a moment. On the Russian side, I want to fight back against the characterization that everything is terrible and the Russian army can't do anything right. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. When you're talking about a lot of regular Russian army units and special operators, the quality of the equipment there is pretty good, even when you're talking about what comes out on social media as opposed to just MOD releases. Good quality equipment, intended for cold weather environments, up to reasonably modern standards. The problem is that there is an immense difference between these Spetsnaz and airborne units and the mobilized personnel that are now being trained or have already been sent to the front in order to plug gaps. Because there's a huge amount of evidence of poorly supplied units in some pretty dire conditions. Even on state TV, these equipment limitations come through. I've got an image in the bottom right there of Solovyev noting these mobilized soldiers who are making knee pads by cutting plastic bottles in two, punching holes in them, and using string to tie them around their legs because there are no knee pads available. And if you've looked at my previous content on Russian mobilization, you already know the rest. Body armor that doesn't protect against anything, helmets that you can crush through with your hand, troops being told that it's bring their own equipment for basically everything other than a weapon, for example, when they're called up to serve. My point is, it often seems like there's two completely diametrically opposite views of the equipment status of the Russian army, and the reality is, both of them are probably true. And there's a full spectrum between those two extremes. I've got an image there of mobilized soldiers from, again, Russian media who are training on their T-62M tank, and you see a couple of contrasting ideas in that image. They've got decent quality warm weather clothing. That stuff will keep them warm during the winter. They've got a relatively modern rifle that they're holding there. No problems there, not caked in rust, not an old 47 variant. That's a reasonable sidearm. The T-62M tank is pretty dire, but this is, like I said, it's a mixed package of equipment, and this is from official Russian sources. Jump on social media and you see a lot of comments around the shortage of equipment now in hiking and sports stores because of the expectation that mobilized personnel bring at least some of their own kit. Prices for body armor, sleeping bags, anything that might be useful for people who are mobilized, those prices have all gone through the roof. You see commentary there by the owner of a hiking and outdoor shop saying they've sold out of sleeping bags within 2 days of the original mobilization. Now, on one hand, I guess the Russian mobilized should feel happy that they can at least buy body armor. That's not something you can do in Australia. But on the other hand, there'd probably be a popular uprising here if the army tried to issue reservists with literal airsoft gear. Not issuing things like tents or sleeping bags or good winter uniform. During summer, those things are a recipe for miserable living conditions. During winter, that's a serious potential problem. And of course, the Russian government has come up with an innovative solution to solve this problem. Namely, it has further restricted public discourse on the discussion of the quality of weapons, training, equipment, or morale of troops that have been mobilized and deployed. Because, I presume, if no one is able to talk about the fact that there is a problem, there is in fact no problem. Genius. So given these failures of official supply mechanisms, sometimes on both sides, volunteers have been critically important in getting equipment to units that are operating on the front lines. In particular, this is often focused on equipment that isn't standard issue, but still very, very valuable. So for example, thermal imaging optics, drones, things that are not standard issue in large quantities, but are very, very valuable for units to have during winter. These things are supplied in large numbers by crowdsourcing. On the Russian side, I've read interviews and stories about organizations that are desperately trying to find things like tents, body armor, survival gear, to get those to mobilized personnel or to, quote, volunteer units or others outside the regular army chain of supply to make sure they don't freeze to death during winter, basically. On the Ukrainian side, Come Back Alive is famous. They supply large numbers of things like drones, thermal images, etc., in order to keep units combat effective while they're waiting for resupply or beyond the resupply offered by their own army. Based on conversations I've had with Ukrainians, while the supply situation is improving over time, volunteers can respond sometimes a lot more quickly than the army bureaucracy can. So if you have a specific requirement right then and there, volunteers might be the fastest way for your unit to fill that particular requirement. So in terms of equipment, how ready are they for winter? Both the Russians and the Ukrainians, based on the evidence that we have available to us. And again here I want to note the limitations of the data that I am working with in terms of images, interviews, and official statements. So far as the Ukrainians go, NATO suggests that they'd met about 50% of Ukraine's requests for winter equipment by early September. In October, Ukraine claimed they'd completely switched over to winter uniforms and that basically they were going to be okay. I note with regards to that comment there that switching to a winter uniform doesn't mean you have enough equipment to sustain outfitting units and replace kit and mobilize new troops, but it is a statement nonetheless. From the thousands of images and anecdotes that I have seen, I've brought one image of Ukrainian troops that I feel encapsulates the situation relatively well in there on the bottom right. Equipment, as I've seen it, this is a vehicle crew operating a self-propelled gun. The uniform, the equipment, it's not uniform. It's different between all the individuals. It's a hodgepodge of donated gear, personally acquired gear, army-issued gear. But generally speaking, it is adequate for the environment. So you will see Ukrainian troops wearing British-issue equipment, Scandinavian-issue equipment, Canadian-issue equipment, all sorts of different European hodgepodge equipment, plus Ukrainian army issue, and stuff that they clearly just bought in the hiking store. But together, collectively, it's very rare that you will see troops on the front lines that aren't outfitted to survive the temperatures and conditions they're operating in. In other words, generally speaking, it does look like they've managed to lash together a solution that will keep their troops, at least in terms of their equipment, protected and effective in winter. On the Russian side, it very much depends on the unit and the situation. Huge variety. I will say that generally speaking, from what I've seen, cold weather clothing isn't really that much of an issue. And that shouldn't be surprising. There should be a lot of cold weather clothing in Russia. Most people who live there should own some that they can take with them. And if you're able to buy some in, roughly military colors, get thermal underwear, put it under the coats or the jackets or whatever the military issues you, whatever camouflage you're given, then at the very least you have clothing that is up to scratch. What seems to be much more spotty are things like tents, survival and camping equipment, generators, heaters, the other things that you need to make a unit protected and combat effective on the front during winter conditions. Quality sleeping bags, for example, very spotty when you look at the images of mobilized units. In some cases, they're still like sleeping on plastic or cardboard on unprotected surfaces in dugouts and things like that. It's not ideal for the conditions at all. At the same time, there will be other units of the regular Russian military, particularly the blingy ones, and probably Wagner as well, that will have some of the best cold weather equipment on the planet. When it comes to whether the militaries have the leadership, the training, the motivation for winter conditions, well, the data is spotty, but what there is seems to suggest that the Ukrainians, generally speaking, have an advantage. This is in the ability to do things like check well-being, rotate units, make sure that units maintain cohesion, aggression, concealment. They're disciplined in how they operate and use their equipment, in how they use fuel. They don't idle engines unnecessarily. The list of things goes on. And I'm not basing the assertion the Ukrainians probably have an advantage here on Ukrainian government sources or anything. I'm focusing on what the pro-Russian channels that are connected to these military units are talking about and complaining about. I'm talking about what might be considered decent Russian units or Russian war reporters and bloggers complaining that the mobilized units do a bunch of stupid shit, essentially. They don't set up their camps correctly. They don't prepare their positions correctly. In the example I've got on the screen, they might park a fuel truck right next to their position and lay a bunch of tripwires right around the place where they're encamping, which is a serious risk for blowing themselves up. There are comments about commanders treating mobilized personnel as essentially disposable, as, quote, meat. And when you regard troops as inherently disposable, it seems unlikely that, especially if you've only given them a 2-week abbreviated training period, which is what many of these mobilized say they have gone through, that they'll have all the survival skills, all the discipline, all the training, all the understanding they need to survive and thrive in a winter environment. Given the very heavy casualties among Russian officers and experienced troops, my question is who is going to be embedded with these mobilized units to give them the skill and the motivation they need to keep themselves safe and combat effective during the winter? The Ukrainian units, at least, include a lot of personnel who've been fighting for longer because mobilization started earlier, and they have the support of troops that are coming out of the training pipelines in Western countries. Zooming up to who is better prepared to deal with logistical issues at an operational level, again, I think this differs by region. For example, around Kherson, where the Ukrainians have just retaken the city, Russia's at the end of very long supply lines, quite tenuous supply lines that can be shelled by Ukrainian artillery or HIMARS. Ukraine, by contrast, has reactivated a train link into the city of Kherson, and a train is a pretty efficient way to bring a lot of supplies in. So in that local case, for example, the Ukrainian position, the ability to handle logistical difficulties, is probably a lot better than the position is for Russian units defending the left bank of the Dnipro. Meanwhile, if you look at other areas that are pushing right up against the Russian border, Russia is very close to rail-based supply lines, Ukraine is further away from its, and the advantage in terms of logistics is likely to rest with the Russians. In terms of mobility, both sides can leverage mobility benefits from cold conditions at the front, but both also face winter-related drag on their operations, i.e., they both gain the ability to operate their tanks more effectively, but both still have the drag of having to push more fuel to the front and support a greater, a more voracious logistic requirement to sustain units in the field. If there is any reason to call that a net advantage to the Ukrainians, it would be that they currently have the initiative on most of the front line, other than areas around Bakhmut, and as a result, an increase in mobility disproportionately favours them. But I will add a personal note there on the issue of fuel logistics, because fuel supplies are a particularly challenging thing if you look at the Ukrainian side of the equation. There's a lot of upward pressure on consumption of fuels like diesel. You've got diesel generators being introduced to towns and cities to make up for electrical disruption. You've got units needing space heaters and generators to keep themselves warm and operational during the winter. You have a motivation for troops to idle their vehicles in order to run the heating and not freeze. You need to turn over engines to make sure they maintain reliability, which eats up more fuel. Uptick in mechanized action. The list of things that requires more and more fuel and diesel goes on, which means there is an increased push on Ukrainian logistics to get that diesel to both civilian centers and to the front. And it remains to be seen how that impacts their operations. Do they have enough diesel trucks and enough fuel trains, and do they have enough diesel stocks to support this uptick in usage? So where does this leave us on balance when evaluating the question of which side is better prepared for winter? So what I say again is that winter conditions reward well-trained, disciplined, well-equipped forces over those forces that are not that. Overall, I would suggest that Ukraine has the edge in that regard. They're better motivated, they're better trained, they're better equipped overall because of the immense support they've received from the West and also the generally high level of motivation in the Ukrainian army that we've seen evidenced. Not universal, but certainly general. In terms of maintaining that picture, Ukrainian volunteers and Western support are critical. The West provides the critical influx of fuel, of money, a lot of the training pipeline, a lot of the winter equipment that's going to be used and consumed during the winter fighting. I also think it's important not to overstate the Russian issues. There are some pretty dire situations out there on the Russian side. I've got one image from social media there, a mobilized soldier in Svatova complaining that they're basically sleeping in a wet pit in the ground. You can see there the sleeping bags are not good, the equipment is not good, the dugout is not good. That is an environment that is going to be cold, wet, dank. That is a genuine threat to the well-being and combat effectiveness of a unit. But that's not going to be the situation for all Russian units. So overall, when you're looking at a tactical and operational level, I'd suggest that winter probably gives the Ukrainians an advantage compared to where they sit now, all else being equal, but it's not going to one-hit kill the entire Russian army by itself. And there are going to be significant parts of the Russian army that feel, well, at home in these conditions. So what then might we see in terms of the fighting over winter? And again, I try to stay away from making predictions in terms of how a particular battle or whatnot will go, and instead I try and identify patterns, trends, and potential contingencies. And one problem with predicting the way the fighting is going to go over winter is that at the moment there's not even any agreement over what Russia's current military objectives are likely to be, and you'd kind of hope that a nation will calibrate its military actions to whatever objective it's trying to achieve. If a country was trying to take over the world's oil supplies, for example, you wouldn't expect it to invade, Switzerland. So in terms of what Russia is trying to achieve at the moment, there's serious disagreement among Western sources, but there's a couple of common Western views. The first is that Russia probably wants time to rest, reconstitute, rebuild itself, train up the mobilized personnel who haven't been deployed, because most of the personnel Russia called up have not been deployed. Some were pushed to the front with no training. They've taken huge casualties, but many of them are still back in Russia training and equipping. Ukraine, meanwhile, it's assumed, probably wants to continue to inflict damage on the Russian army and retain the initiative that it won at Kharkiv and at Kherson. With that in mind, that would predict a Russian Bakhmut offensive to continue and Ukrainian offensives occurring elsewhere. There's also the potential at some point too for Russia going early on any planned spring offensives. So instead of waiting until next year and the improving weather to launch offensives, maybe going early and attacking during the winter. The counterpoint is that the evidence of political mobilization and weapon deployment on the Russian side suggests they still hope for a quick war, and that suggests maybe Russia's going to go for a big attack and a win during this winter. If you look at dissenting views from non-Western sources, or indeed pro-Russian Western sources, there are a couple of them, the main narrative is that we should expect a Russian winter storm-style offensive that will crush the depleted and exhausted Ukrainian military, and they'll be in Kyiv by March, that kind of thing. I have a particular view on this particular question, but because I don't have strong enough evidence to really support or prove it, I'm just going to present these various ideas as they are and leave them as context as we go through the other points of this question. In terms of the overall operational tempo of the war, I think expectations that there'll be some sort of deep halt that will give time for negotiations and regeneration on both sides, I think those are probably wrong. I think that there will be areas where logistics limit actions, but generally, and there will be greater demands for you to rotate units and supply them, but there are opportunities there for both sides, especially when you compare to the mud season they've been fighting in before. So the question is, who is going to go on the offensive during winter? And I think the likely answer is both sides are going to go on the offensive during winter. I expect that Russia will continue to attack at Bakhmut, and you will see other Russian offensives as well. At the same time, you will very likely to see Ukrainian offensive actions, both sides fighting an ongoing battle for the initiative during the winter stage of the conflict. Winter is a drag on operations, it isn't a stop. In terms of conditions at the front, I don't think anyone's going to be having their favourite Christmas of all time. There's a possibility for a significant increase in attrition or loss of combat power when you're talking about units that have insufficient equipment or training or discipline shortfalls that aren't addressed adequately and in time. The reason I say this is in terms of the combat power of a unit, you can have these negative feedback loops, these death spirals. You can have a unit, for example, that hate being in the cold, so military discipline breaks down. Because of that broken down discipline, they're not doing all the things they should be doing in terms of carefully maintaining their equipment, concealing their positions, going out harassing the enemy, being proactive. And as a result, their issues grow. More equipment breaks down, casualties mount, the condition of the unit declines. And because the condition of the unit declines, there's a further loss in discipline, and the further loss in discipline erodes the conditions of the unit, which erodes discipline. You see how that would rapidly become a bit of a problem, a bit of an issue. There will be a continued push to sustain shipments of winter equipment, support, fuel, supplies into Ukraine from the west. The idea here being not just to sustain Ukrainian units, but to allow them to build an advantage during the winter season so that they can maintain the initiative, so they can use this advantage and leverage it against Russian forces. Now, before we closed out, I wanted to raise one more issue, or at least flag it, and that's that winter affects a whole lot more than the people serving on the battlefront. And that's the impact of winter at a strategic and economic level. Winter is an economic challenge, a threat to the old, the frail, or those who are unable to access heating and shelter. The lower the temperature drops, the more energy has to be expended in order to heat homes, heat apartment buildings, heat shelters, and at the same time, the more necessary that heating becomes. Relatively benign temperatures, individuals who are healthy might be able to compensate with thicker clothing, blankets, that sort of thing. But once the temperature dips sufficiently low, some form of heating, whether it's wood-based, gas fires, or central heating, is likely to be essential. And in Ukraine, that is a real and pressing concern. For the people of Russia, winter isn't really a threat. It might threaten their mobilized soldiers or the success on the battlefield, but at home, back in Russia, not really, not at that sort of strategic level. Russia has immense hydrocarbon reserves, domestic prices for those are minimal, it's got interior rail lines and pipelines sufficient for moving supplies, so if you're in one of the major Russian cities and you have access to central heating, you're probably going to have a relatively comfortable winter. Now, there are, of course, Russian citizens that are vulnerable to economic decline or those that don't have access to heating, particularly in rural areas, but that's no different from an ordinary year. Ukraine, however, is not quite so lucky, because Russia's already tipped its hand on its willingness to use winter in a number of ways to try and achieve its objectives. The first was the energy war against the European Union, cutting off supplies of gas in order to try and drive up prices and force the Europeans to fold or capitulate during the winter. I've done a video on how that's going and it'll need an update in 2023. The second point is militarily, providing conditions for their force to regenerate by slowing down the pace of offensive actions everywhere that they're not currently happy to fight. So basically, if winter slows the Ukrainians down everywhere that isn't Bakhmut, then the Russians are probably happy. But the third way is more complicated and in some ways, for the Ukrainian civilian population, by far the most critical. And that's the Russian strategic bombing campaign that has targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, transportation, and critical utilities. The energy facilities and infrastructure that allows Ukraine to heat homes, to power hospitals and public buildings, and provide livable conditions for the population as the temperature drops. At the time of recording, the Ukrainian grid is not entirely repaired, and there's already talk or anticipation that Russia will be launching another missile attack on that infrastructure imminently soon. I was originally going to try and cover this part of the Russian missile campaign, this Russian strategic bombing effort, as part of this episode. Instead, I've concluded it really needs its own. You need to understand the history of strategic bombing, what the Russians are trying to achieve, what supports are being sent in, what the state of the Ukrainian air defense system is, what the economics of this overall effort are in order to understand whether or not it's likely to work. And so, give me a little bit of time, and either next week or the week after, I will put together something to that end. But for now, let me just say this. When assessing whether or not a strategic bombing campaign like the current Russian one is likely to work, you need to consider at least two factors. Firstly, what is the military industrial economic benefit of the strikes? What does it actually impact in terms of the ability of the other country to wage war? What does it mean for logistics, for wartime production, that sort of thing? And the second element is, what does it mean for the willingness of the people to resist? If the first question is whether or not missile strikes can force the Ukrainians into cold and darkness, the second question is whether or not being in the cold and darkness would force the Ukrainians to surrender. I will have a deeper look at this issue either next week or the week after, but I will say this. The Russians are very proud of the Soviet Union's World War II history. Deep in that rich and extensive history are some stories of extreme bravery, heroism, and endurance by civilian populations. When you look at, for example, the siege of Leningrad, you had a situation in which a city, an entire city of millions, was placed under siege, and people died of starvation on a regular basis. And yet, until the end, the city did indeed hold on. If the Germans didn't surrender when Hamburg burned, if the British didn't surrender when London was on fire, if the Japanese didn't give up when Tokyo was set alight, and the Soviet citizens of Leningrad didn't surrender even when they were starving in the streets, then why would the citizens of Kyiv surrender when the lights go out? For many Ukrainians, I expect that winter will bring much suffering, but that doesn't mean it brings Russian victory. On that happy note, let's get to the conclusion. Winter is a harsh operational environment, but it's not one that Russia and Ukraine are not used to. These are countries that are deeply familiar with winter operations. The winter environment does place a much greater premium on discipline, training, and equipment than more benign conditions. It favours the prepared and punishes the ill-prepared. Now, those factors generally, in my opinion, not universally, but generally, relatively strongly favour the Ukrainians. Economically, however, winter is a much greater threat to Ukraine than Russia, and that's an issue that we'll pick up in the future. Operationally, we would expect offensive actions even if winter drags on the tempo. The war will not freeze, pardon the pun, the war will continue, and there will be offensive actions by both sides, probably all through the winter. Attrition and decay of units, however, is a real risk, particularly when you're talking about recently mobilised units and personnel, if they're not properly provisioned, trained, and led. There is an immense danger that a number of these Russian mobilised units, if they are not significantly improved in terms of the quality of their equipment and leadership, that they'll be significantly impacted by the winter. Contrary to the popular historical characterization, General Winter is not a Russian citizen. The Winter is not loyal to any particular country or flag. It follows very simple rules. It punishes the ill-prepared, and it respects those that respect the challenges that it sets forth. Time will now tell which army has done a better job of preparing for what winter has to offer. Okay, channel update to close out. Firstly, thank you to all patrons who voted in the poll on what charities would be getting the next round of donations. I'll be sharing the details of that with the general listening group next week. In saying that, I want to make a quick note that the reason those donations are possible is because of the presence of sponsorships on the channel. That's where the funding for those donations comes from. So I want to express my thanks to those of you who are supportive of the fact that sponsors appear on the channel. At the same time, I do try to be discerning. The vast majority of sponsorship offers are turned down, and for that reason, I haven't been linked to some of the recent scandals or issues that have come up on YouTube around certain sets of sponsors, and I hope to keep it that way. In the event I'm ever supporting a cause that I have not personally used and doesn't deserve the time on this channel, I'm sure people will call that out. For now, my rule is I will only support things on the channel that I have used as a product and that I'm happy to put forward. In terms of supporting the ongoing growth and improvement of the channel, there's a lot going on here. I'm aware there's a lot going on here, so let's go through it quickly. The first is in terms of subscriber growth. It's been absolutely phenomenal. I'm kind of excited. There is a chance we get to 300,000 by the end of the year. I think that's a fantastic goal, but even if we don't make it, it's just been the most phenomenal journey watching the way this channel has evolved over the last 6 months or so. It's absolutely incredible, and I cannot thank you enough. You have also, all of you, put up for a long time with some pretty dodgy, let's be honest, sound quality. My sound guy does his best, but the reality is when I'm recording, half of the problem is that I tend to record in crappy environments, often hotel rooms, and the second thing is the equipment that I'm using could frankly be better. So I'm working on, thanks to my patrons, a comprehensive upgrade to my sound system, maybe some adjustments to the room that I do record in when I'm not traveling, for example, and hopefully that will lead to an improvement in the sound quality in the new year. I will keep you all up to date. In terms of upcoming episode plan, I'm working on an episode and have been for some time on Russian strategic bombing efforts, so the missile campaign against energy infrastructure, what that means. So that is definitely on the agenda, and there's some more defense economic topics coming along the lines as well. With that said, I want to extend a particular thanks to those of you who do send me email submissions. I know there's a significant backlog, but I appreciate all the material that I receive, and I also appreciate those of you who have agreed to be expert contacts, so that when I do episodes like this, I can reach out and confirm my understanding or confirm my sources before I go and put it in an episode like this one. Finally, I'd like to note that I am working on some opportunities to be interviewed by other channels, because people have often asked me a bunch of questions, and I feel like that sort of Q&A format might be a great way to address it. I'm hoping that those can be made to work. If they can't, then I might work on some sort of QA format episode in the new year. We'll see. That's probably something I'll put by the patrons before I shape it up into an actual episode concept. In any case, thank you very much for listening. It's very much appreciated, and I will see you all again next week.